Welcome to the 415th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I welcome ASHTON VERDERY-A back to COVID calls to talk about COVID bereavement and its long-term impacts on children and families. Just a reminder, you can usually catch COVID calls live on weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to the COVID calls YouTube channel to watch. You can hear COVID calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle @USOfDisaster or @COVIDCalls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. And as always, please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of February 16th, 2022, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center, the COVID death total in the United States is 928,034 lives lost. South Korea, going through its Omicron wave right now, reports 7,202 deaths from COVID-19. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. The headline is, "A New Jersey mother of 4 died of COVID-19 before she could hold her newborn son." This appeared in mycentraljersey.com. Published January 19th, 2022, was written by Cheryl Macon. Jill Stanley gave birth to her 4th child, a son named Jaden, on Christmas Eve, 2021. In announcing her pregnancy last fall, Stanley called Jaden an Irish twin to his sister Jordan, 11 months old, adding that he would even out her clan, 2 boys, and 2 girls. Just 3 weeks later, Stanley was gone. The 37-year-old died of COVID-19 related complications on January 12, 2022 at Robert Wood Johnson University Hospital in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Stanley never got to hold her newborn son. Family and friends are left to mourn Stanley, whom they called a beautiful soul. Michelle Stanley is survived by her children, Samantha, 19, Noah, age 4, Jordan, and Jaden. She's also survived by her parents, John and Susan Stanley, her partner, Frank Allen, and her 2 brothers, Sean and Jack Stanley, according to her obituary. Described by family and friends on social media as a vivacious, fun, and loving woman, Stanley was dedicated to children, her own, and the many she cared for and taught as a child care director. She valued education highly and loved being around children. Born in New Brunswick and raised in Franklin, New Jersey, Michelle Stanley earned education degrees from Raritan Valley Community College and Caldwell University. According to her obituary, she graduated last year from Rutgers University with a master's degree in education. In October of 2021, she posted a photo of herself rocking her cap on the way to graduation ceremonies and planning to wear it all day. Before her graduation from Raritan Valley Community College, Stanley told a mycentraljersey.com reporter that necessity started her career in early childhood education. "I started working at a daycare center so I could make money and bring Samantha for free at the time," she said, she added that a boss encouraged her to pursue studies in the field because she was good with children. Michelle Stanley overcame several hurdles to reach this milestone. She once lost her apartment because of a legal dispute with the complex's owner and was forced to seek shelter assistance. In her final semester at RVCC, she not only cared for her daughter while taking 6 classes, but also worked 2 jobs and accumulated field experience. When I really think about it, it's almost like a dream. I felt like I dreamt this was going to happen, but I could never picture how it would feel, Stanley said. "It's very emotional for me and it feels really good." On social media, Samantha said she was so proud of her mother and her accomplishments, adding that she impacted so many people and is an inspiration. The story was a New Jersey mother of 4 died of COVID-19 before she could hold her newborn son. Michelle Stanley died in January of 2022. Okay, I'd like to turn to the conversation for today, and I'm really pleased to bring ASHTON VERDERY back to COVID Calls. Let me introduce him. ASHTON M. Verdery, PhD, is an associate professor of sociology, demography, and computational and data science at the Pennsylvania State University. His research focuses on how changes in social and family networks influence health. ASHTON, welcome back to COVID Calls.
Thank you for having me back. I'm excited to be here.
So I wanted to ask you, first of all, just as I usually do, just where you're calling from and what the pandemic situation is looking like there today.
Yeah, I'm calling from State College, Pennsylvania. It's a smallish college town in the middle of the state of Pennsylvania. The pandemic situation, we suffered a relatively large spike with the Omicron wave, but it has been returning back to kind of a baseline level. I believe we're just about to cross like 50 cases per 100,000 or something like that. So it's getting better, and I think we're kind of on the downward slope of a difficult period. But it feels nice with spring coming to have that hope in the air.
And you're part of a college community there with one of the largest populations of college students anywhere in the world.
Yes.
So what kind of preparations, precautions, restrictions are underway right now?
The university has, kind of free testing available for a lot of people, and the restrictions and other kind of rules that they've imposed have kind of varied over the year. At one point, they had vaccine verification and things like that, and if you were not vaccinated, you'd have to test more frequently. They didn't want to call it a mandate, but it was sort of you could be tested quite frequently or be vaccinated policy. In addition to those, there's still universal indoor masking on campus, and in certain parts of the community, some of the kind of residential areas have different rules because there's a series of boroughs that all have different ordinances. But so there is quite a bit of masking, and many of the restaurants and local businesses are sort of still enforcing that.
So you were a guest on COVID Calls March 18th. I went back and looked, March 18th, 2021. And so I wanted to ask you maybe for kind of an update, just your own personal journey in this COVID time, in that last year. Anything really stand out to you?
I think, on a personal level, one thing that was incredibly exciting was when my older daughter was able to get the vaccine. She turned 5 in November, and her kind of eligibility for that really made us feel a lot better. We were able to send children back to daycare at around that time, and made a number of other changes that has really benefited our kind of work-life balance and happiness. And I think it's been very good for the kids to have more interaction with people other than me, telling them about random statistics and whatnot. So that has been really good. We are still hoping for kind of the under 5 vaccines, but my understanding is that trial is taking longer than was originally anticipated. So that isn't available for my younger daughter yet. But we still feel relatively confident. Their daycare is doing a great job. They've had very few cases. And so that's been huge in my personal life. In terms of my research life, one of the big kind of shifts that I've made in the past year is from studying, this COVID-19 related bereavement and health associations in the short term to beginning to think about the magnitude of the long-term challenges that this will pose for different societies and health. In addition, I've also been working extensively to contextualize this kind of acute shock that it came from the COVID-19 bereavement wave against other bereavement types and caused by other sorts and at different time periods in different places. So that's been occupying a lot of my research time as well.
I'm picturing you describing your kids at home there, and you're running a sort of a home statistics training lab there.
That's what we're trying for, yeah.
And congratulations. I'm glad your daughter could get get vaccinated. Did she have opinions about it? Was she looking forward? I know kids don't look forward to getting shots, but some kids I think were looking forward to participating in this way, doing their part.
Yeah, she was actually. I was surprised at the level of excitement that she had. We had talked about it a bit, and we said, "Do you want to do it?" And she's like, "Yes, I want to do it as soon as possible." And so she did it. She got the vaccine, and I think she just really wanted to kind of feel like a bigger kid. I think was part of it. It was knowing that it wasn't available to her because she was still 4 at the time, and then that when she was 5, it would be available was a big motivator for her wanting to do it. And so maybe like getting your ears pierced or something like that. I think
Right.
kind of the same idea. She was very excited about that, and she picked out. We let her get a special treat for doing it, and she picked out a cookbook magazine of chocolate recipes. So it was actually a very smart play on her.
That is smart.
She's been getting an awful lot of chocolate because I keep having to make all these recipes in the cookbook for her.
Oh my God, what a brilliant move! That's
I know.
amazing. Wow, that's great. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. Wonderful to hear that update. I want to ask you also that the last time we talked, the death toll at that time in the United States, as reported by Johns Hopkins, was 538,095, and it was 2,682,931 deaths at that time, March 18th, 2021. I've been asking guests recently, and I really wanted to ask you, based on your expertise, just what you think of the landscape of counting generally around COVID. What kind of confidence do you have in these, particularly in the mortality numbers and the death numbers in the United States, but any other numbers? Because you're keeping a very close tab on these sorts of things. And I just feel like among the expert community, I hear generally there's an undercount. But then once you go one level below that, I hear all kinds of things about what we should be paying attention to. So help me out with that.
Right. There are a number of problems with the kind of death registration systems. And it's really difficult to talk about it as a one-size-fits-all approach. So I guess I could say one thing generally about the world and then talk more specifically about the US. Globally, one of the biggest challenges is that many, many countries in the world lack, for lack of a better word, adequate vital registration systems. And so we really are flying blind on what kinds of impacts this might have in places in many, sub-Saharan Africa, some Southeast Asian countries, elsewhere in the world as well. And so, the lack of vital registration systems really precludes us from understanding how big of a shock this might have been in some places. And I think is a strategic weakness, both from a scientific standpoint in terms of we don't learn as much as we could and therefore lack the ability to innovate and things like that, but also from a policy standpoint or even a strategic standpoint where we would want to know that there might be a spike, say in, just to pick a country like Burkina Faso or something like that, of mortality from an unknown cause. And currently our systems to detect that sort of thing are rudimentary. I mean, there are some systems, but they're still a little bit rudimentary. And I think that improvements in those regards would pay substantial dividends for countries like the United States to be able to detect things like this and potentially channel resources to mitigate future pandemics or something like that. So there are challenges globally. In terms of within the United States, the system is relatively sophisticated compared to what I was describing in other places of the world, but still has a number of gaps and challenges. In particular, one of the challenges is it is a decentralized system where independent coroners are making decisions in different locales, and there's sort of a lack of cohesive, agreed upon ways that things are decided in those regards. Now, of course, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention does heroic effort, kind of coding things into underlying causes of death and things like that. But there still is a lot of slippage, and so there were some reports a few months back about coroners never classifying deaths as COVID because they didn't believe it and things like that, which I think is a quite a big challenge that we've faced. And so I think continued improvement of death registration systems would really benefit the world overall, but also the United States and other kind of rich countries.
Do you think that?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, keep going, keep going. I was just going to ask you if you think this is an inflection point of some sort based on this almost unprecedented event in the United States.
I would hope that this will increase kind of funding for and efforts to have baseline systems of kind of disease monitoring and things like that. One of the other challenges that's related to this is not just on the death counting side, but on the general social survey side. The things that the US lacked that other countries had that I think was quite beneficial for them were kind of nationally representative seroprevalence surveys, so they could detect increases in cases and things like that from a principled standpoint, rather than just looking at the number of cases in clinics, where you don't know if that's because more people are reporting to clinics or more people are infected. There's all sorts of reasons that a convenience sample like that would be problematic. But a kind of randomized sample where we can track people who are not infected becoming infected, I think would be quite beneficial. And some states in the US have had this. I believe like Indiana had this. Some of the universities pursued similar approaches. And I think that was quite successful in ability to kind of mitigate some of the pandemic challenges.
So thank you for that discussion. And just brief recap, because your work first came across my screen in the summer of 2020. And it was a really profound study that you published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that summer with colleagues, and introduced a concept which was called the grief multiplier, in which you're trying to understand the broader bereavement effects on families and close connections for every death. And it was, if we sort of take us back to that time in the summer of 2020, I mean, the deaths per day then were fewer than they are now. Probably, I'd have to get those two depending on when we were talking. But it was, I mean, the numbers at that time really made people sit up straight. And then you introduced this grief multiplier concept, which took it much further and talked about, what a single death actually means is much more than people are talking about and realizing. That was an important study, I think, for a lot of people. And there was research that followed that next year as you dug a little deeper and to try to understand the further dimensions of that, including the racial dimensions of that in the United States. I'm not nearly doing this service, but I just wanted to, lay a little of the groundwork. You published a piece with your colleagues, Rachel Kidman, Rachel Margolis, and Emily Smith Greenaway in the Washington Post in, I believe, April of 2021. And there you summarized one of your more recent studies in Journal of American Medical Association Pediatrics. I'm just going to quote one sentence from it. You argued there that for every 13 COVID-19 deaths, one child under the age of 18 loses a parent. And you estimated then that 40,000 children in the United States have lost a parent to COVID-19 since February of 2020. So it's a tremendous body of work, because it's, first of all, you're talking about bereavement and the multiplier, and then you zero in on children and on the racial aspects of it. What else should I emphasize there? I think for people who want to go back and listen to the previous COVID calls can hear more about it in detail, but how you see that work now and what parts of it should I have described more clearly?
Well, you described it phenomenally clearly. It's funny. I went back and listened, and I believe I referenced a kind of paper that was under embargo that I couldn't talk about too much. That was that manuscript, and I guess I didn't get in trouble, so that's good. But I think we were one of the earliest groups to recognize that even though COVID-19 skews old in terms of its deaths, older adults are much more likely to die than younger adults. The sheer magnitude of the pandemic and a non-trivial death rate among people in their 40s and 50s is enough to kind of result in a large number of children losing a parent to the disease. And I think, thinking through that, the scale of that, we were quite shocked that it was, 40,000 at the time. Subsequent analyses have suggested it might even be substantially higher now. I believe there's a group with Susan Hillis as one of the authors, and Imperial College of London has an online resource where you can sort of track in different countries children who have lost caregivers. And I believe the estimate that they've come up with is over 200,000 by this point. And the pandemic shifting into younger ages has kind of shifted and made it even more consequential for children, a larger number of them. And so I was very interested in kind of trying to get the information out there that this is not just something that affects individuals who are older adults, but it affects people of all ages. And when you start thinking of our relationships among people and that people are connected to others, these deaths reverberate in society in ways that the raw statistics on the age of people who die or the raw numbers of people who die don't capture the magnitude of the kind of the echo that these things create in the lives of people who have lost loved ones. I think of that story that the obituary you read at the beginning of this, speaking about Michelle, was it Stanley, and her children, and they're going to grow up in very different circumstances because of this disease than they would have in the absence of it.
In the opinion piece that you published in last year in the Washington Post, and so that's the context there is early in the Biden administration, and I'm just going to quote it's a really well written piece and very clear, asking for intervention. Quoting here, "These children need our help. Universal policies to support vulnerable families are a good start. Many of President Biden's policy proposals address the collateral damage parental death can cause, such as food insecurity and an absence of high-quality, affordable childcare. High on our priority list would be providing the resources to open school safety," and you go on and talk about other sorts of interventions. So almost a year later, what do you think? I mean, has there been substantial policy intervention to take account for the impact on children?
In terms of tailored policies, I don't think that there has been substantial intervention. In terms of sort of general policies, my understanding was that the Biden tax credit was having a number of kind of ancillary benefits for children, the expanded child tax credits and things like that, greatly reduced child poverty and things like that. And those are the sorts of things that I think would help. I believe there's also substantial funding for kind of upgrading infrastructure in schools that maybe helped reopen. In terms of tailored policies for children who lose parents to this disease, I think that there's still a bit of a stall on that. And I wish that there would be more movement. I think that the most likely way that there will be more movement on that is if we recognize that these are not the only children who lose their parents. And that if we recognize that this COVID crisis has created an extra 20% in our estimates per year of children who are losing parents, but that there's still a large number of other children who lose parents to other diseases as well. And I think that maybe bundling some of the concerns with the opioid crisis, the broader homicide crisis, the suicide crisis, and the COVID crisis might direct some more attention towards the very large number of children who lose parents and otherwise fare poorly. There's a great study by David Weaver which shows that children who lose parents before the age of 18 just in general face a more difficult future. They are less likely to complete higher education and have lower earnings in adulthood and other things like that. But that the children who have greater kind of access to support, particularly governmental support, tend to do better within that difficult circumstance. And so I hope that work continues to catalyze kind of congressional action. And my sense is that there is some kind of congressional action on this. I was watching a briefing the other day with the Surgeon General. There was some discussion of children who have lost parents to COVID-19 and children who've lost parents to other diseases and the long-term health ramifications of that. And so hopefully there will be some action on this.
Let me just ask you a few of the nuances of this, one of which has to do with how we can get past death in terms of taking stock of the impact on children. But I mean, long COVID, the numbers, again, are sort of all over the place in terms of, what the overall numbers of long COVID cases may be or how to even predict that going forward. And it's different countries. I've seen different numbers reported in Europe, the United States. But we are potentially looking, in addition to what you described, causes of death during this COVID era, all kinds of long-term disability or just parents in general being sick. some of them multiple times, even after having been vaccinated. How do you think about those kinds of impacts on families and on children specifically?
I think it's a big challenge for children. I think that the years without school also have taken quite a toll, and you can see huge educational disparities widening as well. In terms of families, I haven't monitored the data closely on, say, divorce or fertility or things like that, but many countries are registering some of the lowest fertility rates that they've ever recorded. I know China's was incredibly low this year. The US, I believe, is quite low this year. So there are indications that some family formation aspects are being kind of impacted by this, and people might be delaying childbirth and things like that. In terms of divorces, I don't know about kind of family dissolution sort of things, but I would expect that the difficulty that this crisis has imposed on families will, in the future, create possibly new levels of divorce and other challenges as well. It's been a stressful time for parents, I think.
And what's the geographical, when we take into account how these impacts might be playing out in different parts of the country, is it uniform?
So the children who have lost parents are far from uniform. One, there's been a big racial disparity within that, where non-Hispanic Black individuals and and Hispanic individuals have had the highest levels of loss of caregivers and parents from COVID-19. And it is concentrated in certain parts of the country in ways that I think were a little bit surprising. I referenced a paper by Susan Hillis and colleagues, and I'll refer back to that same paper. I believe it's in Pediatrics. And they have some maps of where these impacts have been the hardest. And I was quite shocked that some of the places it looked like, I believe the Rio Grande Valley in Texas had quite high rates, for instance, and other places had lower rates. And it didn't quite accord with my sense of where the virus severity or the death statistics have been the highest. So there has been kind of differences that lead to kind of nuances in those regards. In terms of challenges, I believe that there's a widening gap between like what people in the US refer to as like red counties and blue counties, whether they voted for Trump or Biden, in terms of kind of COVID-19 death rates. And I expect that those are contributing to some of these challenges in the bereavement space as well. Early on, the pandemic was concentrated in kind of urban areas, New York, New Jersey, and things like that. And so I think that a lot of the bereavement of the first wave was felt in those places, but subsequent impacts, I think, have been more broadly diffused throughout the country, and been a big factor in that.
I wanted to follow up also about the bereavement concept generally, and how it may be impacted by factors of scale and time, because and so maybe you could even just kind of define bereavement as it's used by researchers like yourself, but also we're 2 years into this pandemic, and I don't in general like war as a metaphor, because I think we have other things we can reach to, other pandemics, for example. However, I do think about the analogy of war dragging on for multiple years, and this sort of notion of desensitization. And so I wonder, does bereavement mean the same thing to you as a researcher in the summer of 2020 as it does now? Do people somehow become more inured to loss as time goes on, or is that not the right way to think about this?
Right. So I guess one thing is there's some definitional issues that I think would help. One is, generally people distinguish between the idea of bereavement, which is just the fact of a loss, loss of a loved one, and then the sort of feelings about that, which might include grief, which is sort of being upset about the loss, and then actual kind of psychological disorders, including like post-traumatic stress disorder, some of the grief disorders and things like that, that might be basically unhealthy responses to grief. And so, what we looked at in that first article where we were trying to document how many people lose a loved one. In that article, we were looking at bereavement, just the fact of a loss. We were unable to look at grief or depression or any of the kind of psychological conditions that might arise from that. In subsequent work, we did establish that those who lost loved ones to COVID-19 had much higher rates of depression than others in their society. And in that paper, which came out in Journal of Gerontology Social Scientists last year, with Hao-Wei Wang as the principal author, in that paper, we tested whether the experience of grief, experience of depression that might come about after a bereavement event was larger in countries where there was more bereavement or less bereavement. We didn't find any difference between countries in those regards. Now that said, I have a sneaking suspicion that country is not the right level to look at that kind of thing, that perhaps it aggregates a little bit too much, and you'd want to really compare maybe cities or states or counties that had larger amounts and smaller amounts. But we're just not able to do that with the data that was available. What we are looking at now is whether that is, changed over time. Has it persisted longer in different places and things like that? We don't have answers to that, but that's some of the kind of current research questions that we're investigating.
I mean, that's really fascinating. So, and that's an important distinction, and thank you for that distinction to make. I mean, that early on, you're really just taking stock of who might have the likelihood to people are bereaved, but then what's the impact of that over time, and who will have the likelihood of having longer term impacts? And it seems like that. So that's the direction of your research going forward. Then I suppose trying to understand those impacts over time. So explain a little bit some of the questions that you're asking here. For example, you were talking about post-traumatic stress and other kinds of related disorders. What kind of timeframes are you talking about here? I mean, are you going to be following a generation or even intergenerational impacts of COVID-19, and what are you looking for?
Right. So we have a series of papers on this, and I don't want to bore you with all the details of paper A and B and stuff. But one of them is looking at whether those who were bereaved, who lost a spouse or other loved one to COVID-19, so the person who died of COVID-19, whether they are faring worse than comparable people who lost someone to a disease, a different disease, say a heart attack or something like that. And what we found in that manuscript is, and that we're hoping that it'll come out soon. What we found in that manuscript is that it is worse, that losing someone to COVID-19 is worse. We were not able to distinguish whether that is because of the time period, so the restrictions on funeral gatherings and things like that, versus being because of losing someone to a disease where they die suddenly with a substantial amount of medical intervention and what is classically called a bad death. So we haven't distinguished that, but we can say that losing someone to COVID-19 appears to, at least in the first 3 months after the event, be associated with worse kind of mental health symptoms. And what I think is very scary about this is that there's a substantial amount of research that shows that people who have the most severe mental health responses to a bereavement event subsequently have the greatest health declines that can be attributed to that bereavement event, subsequently have greater mortality that is attributable to the bereavement event, and things like that. So it's almost like an early warning sign or a risk, like a flag that says this is a person that might be in particular trouble. And our results suggest that not only are there a much larger number of people bereaved because of COVID-19, but that these bereavements are also worse in terms of short-term mental health challenges that they're facing, which I think portends a potentially dire future in terms of the health risks that these people might face. So that's sort of a couple kind of projects that we're working on in the short term. And what we're working on in the more intermediate term, in terms of impacts, is looking to see whether those individuals actually do pass away at quicker rates, whether they do develop additional physical health challenges, high blood pressure, things like that, that portend kind of earlier mortality in the longer term. And also whether they develop dementia. There's a body of research suggesting that bereavement may contribute to dementia through kind of loneliness and other mechanisms. Deborah Umberson has a number of papers about this. And so we're looking at whether there are increased dementia risks for people that experience this as well. So that's sort of like moving from a 3-month short-term mental health window to a maybe 6-month to 2-year mortality and kind of chronic conditions window. And then I have another manuscript coming up soon. One second. That we'll be presenting this spring that looks at the kind of population, the long-term population impacts of this. So how quickly does the bereaved population from COVID-19 kind of age out of the population? And obviously, the spouses, people who lose spouses to COVID-19 will eventually pass away. But the people who lost their parents might be around for 40 or 50 years. And so we're looking at how different countries might be experiencing, for lack of a better word, churn in their populations of people who were exposed to this bereavement event and how that might play out in the next 40 or 50 years.
So you're working at 3 different scales at least here. And so let me follow up a little bit. What kind of analogs are you working with historically? I mean, as a historian, I'm really curious, you know, can we come back to war, or maybe 1918, 1919 influenza pandemic? What are you working from? Where's the body of data that helps you understand what we're comparing this wave of bereavement to?
So one of the comparisons that we are trying to do is some of the wars that the United States has experienced, which were very different mortality profiles. You know, the World War II,
Right.
you know, almost everyone who died was under 35 because that was sort of the soldier eligibility age and things like that. So we are making some comparisons to that. In addition, we're sort of drawing from some theoretical insights. There's a great manuscript by Diego Alburaz Gutierrez that looks at the genocide in, now I'm not going to say the country and I'm going to feel like a fool.
In Rwanda or in?
It was El Salvador or Guatemala, and I should have looked this up before I brought it up. I believe it was Guatemala. And there was a genocide that occurred, and he looks at sort of this population memory of the experience of this genocide among this indigenous group that experienced it. And it, you know, one thing that is really interesting about the manuscript is he finds that actually the proportion of the population who lost a loved one to this disease, to this genocide, actually grows over time. When you start accounting for people who's, you know, never grew up, who grew up without their grandparents around and things like that. As the population grows, you actually sort of the holes are almost magnified. I think it's a really fascinating study in those regards. But it also, one thing I like about that study is it brings up the issue that we talked about earlier with data and things like that. The only reason he was able to do that study is because there happened to be some censuses taken. I believe one was taken by a power company in the area where they sort of knew all the population. They were able to compare exactly who was lost and then track that over time. And so it sort of speaks to the power that this data can have to kind of witness these events and better prepare us to understand disasters, which I think is a broad challenge that we still face because we don't have great data in many places.
I mean, it's what a research challenge. Going back to you were talking earlier about your really interesting findings that COVID bereavement seems to be worse, more impactful than other kinds of bereavement based on your sort of early studies right now. And you suggested a few possible reasons for that, you know, related to this sort of bad death concept, something that could have been avoided or something that happened suddenly. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that and if that will change. We're going to continue to have COVID deaths around the world and in the United States for a long time. Does the impact of the bereavement decline as the overall numbers decline, as the medical interventions get better? Again, I'm just sort of trying to get at the problems of following this as a research problem over months and ultimately years, which it seems like you are going to be doing.
Right. I know it's a lot, on the kind of research docket. You had Debbie Carr, I believe, on your show at some point.
I did.
And, you know, she discussed this concept of a bad death. She's done substantial work on this concept. But, you know, broadly put, I think bad deaths can be summarized as those that make individuals, first, that when the person dies, when they're in pain, when it's unexpected, when there are a substantial amount of medical interventions, when there is a lack of ability to kind of be with the person or sit with them, those things all kind of exacerbate bad deaths. But she has a great paper about the COVID-19 crisis and how it is likely to, cause these bad deaths. That kind of moves beyond just thinking about the person who died's circumstance, which is very important. But also, bad deaths are exacerbated when it increases financial strain for individuals, when their other supports are not there. And I think the early portion of the COVID-19 crisis really exemplified that. Many people were out of work, chasing around children, trying to care for loved ones, all those sorts of things. And that made it kind of compounded the problem. And then to make it even worse, there were these restrictions on funerals. There were all these other things that made it very difficult. And so my hypothesis, although we can't examine this, built from Debbie's work, would be that as those latter two kind of items go away, as the financial turmoil that COVID originally wrought subsides, and as these restrictions on kind of gathering and things like that dissipate, then it should be a little bit less bad. But it's still unclear whether the extent to which these bad deaths were driving it, or whether it was something about the circumstances of the COVID-19 crisis, or if it was something about the circumstances of COVID-19 itself, if that makes sense. If it's a crisis factor or a disease factor. Does that make sense?
It does. And there's another variable I wanted to bring in related to COVID. And it's been on my mind since the news recently about the Sandy Hook parents who won a major court case, I believe quite recently, against gun manufacturers, and also won a court case, some of the parents against a misinformation website, and as Alex Jones. And so COVID is, so every disaster has its detractors. And I think that's one of the things we find pretty consistently in disaster research. There's a sort of a pro-social phase of people helping, but there's also a lot of antisocial aspects related, and victims often get blamed. Is that another feature here that you can somehow capture in the data, or work on intuition now and try to understand over time? Because of any disaster I've seen or studied in American history, the victim blaming, the outright misinformation, the violence against survivors and healthcare workers, it's pretty much off the charts. And I wonder how that folds in again to these sort of longer term problems of bereavement and coping with a bad death.
I do think that likely plays a role. There's a book by Nicholas Christakis called Apollo's Arrow, and he describes, he said, he has a great quote in there, something like the fifth horseman of the apocalypse is misinformation. And I really thought that was very true, at least in the COVID crisis. I do think that people losing a loved one to COVID-19 early on, and perhaps still to this day, individuals there might be people who don't believe them or accuse them of making it up, or things like that. You've certainly seen people accusing hospitals of falsely coding death statistics and things like that to get money, or somehow, it never was clear on the mechanism by which this would work, but somehow kind of use it to illicitly gain money or something. And so I imagine that kind of feelings of loneliness would exacerbate the challenges associated with this. In terms of individuals and families, I imagine that part of the problem might also be kind of family-based rifts that people are experiencing. Not talking to siblings or something like that because of politicization of aspects of the virus. And I've certainly read a number of op-eds by people who lost loved ones to COVID-19 who describe feeling left behind by society as people are out dancing in the streets last summer when vaccines were pretty broadly available in the United States and cases were low. People felt, I think, quite left behind by this crisis, and as if their grief was not being remembered properly. And so I'd be curious to see how that plays out over time. I'm not aware of any quantitative research that has examined that, but it could be a very fruitful topic for additional kind of interview-based studies or something like that.
I know that the family is sort of at the core of the sort of analytical units that you work with, and that's the data that's often available. But I've also been thinking about occupational groups, and I had physician infectious disease physician Peter Chin Hong on yesterday, and he was talking about the problem of moral injury for healthcare workers. So that they're treating people and being treated badly, either by their employers or by, in some cases, those that they're trying to save, or unvaccinated people who are in the ER. There's that, and then there's also the high rate of illness and death among healthcare workers who continue to be at the front lines throughout this. Is some of the work you're doing, is there a way to work to extend some of those insights to occupational types? I think here also previous disasters like September 11, in which the occupational groups, say, first responders, firefighters, their bereavement was so intense that then there was a following wave of mental stress, health impacts, and those have been traced out now over 20 years. Pretty significant impacts, I think.
Yeah, I mean, shockingly significant. In fact, Rachel Kidman, who you discussed earlier and had on the show before, her colleague, Sean Clouston, who I've co-authored with, has done some of this work on the 9/11 first responders, and the elevated rates of stress and Alzheimer's and all sorts of health challenges that they faced are quite shocking. In terms of occupational groups, I do think it would be feasible to extend it. It's not something that I'm planning to look at, but I do think it would be worthwhile to extend some of the work that we've considered in these regards to those groups. The healthcare workers are a resource that underpins our society, and I guess one thing that COVID has laid bare for a lot of people, I think, is all these things that we just sort of expected to work in the background. We're realizing work because of people, and when those people are damaged and when they die and things like that, the system kind of comes more to a halt than we I think would have anticipated pre-COVID. And at least for me, that's been kind of shocking. When the daycare closes because the teachers aren't there, not just because it wants to close. And so I think that that's been a real challenge with COVID-19 that has laid bare this kind of way in which our society is driven by people working together or failing to.
Let me ask you a researcher's question, just tying back to some of the projects you were describing that are underway right now. You've been working with large data sets. As it becomes a more of a sort of longitudinal study that may go on, we were just talking about September 11, you may be working on this that long, and certainly I think some researchers will be working on this for their entire careers. Do you narrow the focus somehow? I mean, do you then try to find a cohort that you can work with and follow over a long period of time? Do you try to zero in, when there are other maybe important moments, like 5-year, 10-year anniversaries and things like that? Like how do you think about building the longitudinal study so that you can make further sense of the insights that you have right now?
Right. So I think that there are sort of two general strategies that I'm pursuing. One is continuing to work with large-scale secondary data sets that sort of were in existence and planned to be in existence beyond COVID-19. And one of the surveys that we're using is the Survey of Health, Aging, and Retirement in Europe, where it's a very large sample of 60,000 individuals over the age of 50, and it sort of refreshes every couple of years, and they're following these people until they die, basically. And so we're able to pick up a large number of individuals who had COVID-19, who lost loved ones to COVID-19, et cetera. And we expect that we'll be able to follow them through multiple cohorts. We have similar kind of projects planned with various US-based studies and other studies in other countries that are kind of comparable. So that's sort of this like large-scale secondary data analysis. The gap there, I think, is that in particular, children are not well studied in these large cohorts. And that really precludes ability to kind of study like the long-term health impacts for children of this disease. And that's one of those kind of data failures that I think would be nice to remedy in general. In terms of the alternate strategy to kind of look at this, I have a project in review now with some colleagues from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where we're using census-based data and linking it to kind of alternate sources of data, including health records and things like that, to be able to examine similar ideas sort of using administrative data. And we could with that, potentially follow people over time and sort of build with a non-survey based data platform, a study of like a cohort that we could look at these sorts of things. But that's in development. It'll be several years before we're able to do that.
And the reason that you have trouble studying children in general, and then more specifically with COVID, it has to do with privacy for those who are minors. It has to do with unwillingness of parents to enroll children in studies. What's the complication?
So there are some cohort studies of children out there, but they're not. They tend to be, I guess, very educational focused. For instance, there's a lot of
course, yeah,
them that focus on that sort of thing, and so they might not pick up that sort of exposure within the survey. In addition, there just are not a ton of them that are widely used. Like there's some, like, so the Eccles survey is one, early childhood longitudinal educational study, and there are some that go on, but they're not as continuously refreshed among young children. And so there are some challenges with this. I mean, that said, there are studies that you could do this with. They're not the ones that I'm as familiar with. In addition, I should say, the loss of a parent or other close relative for children, even though a large number of children have lost someone, it's still a quite rare event. And so if you have a study of 10,000 people, 10,000 kids under 18, that's a Herculean task to find them and survey them over time. So there are some studies like that, but you're not going to get a large number of them who have lost a parent to COVID-19 in a study like that. And so you wouldn't be able to really study those individuals very precisely, because you might only get 15 or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does make sense. But at the same time, I mean, those numbers might seem relatively small, but and what we've been discussing, they could become magnified over time, depending on the health impacts that those people have, that then reverberate and create a sort of a cycle or an intergenerational experience of bereavement for things that might go well beyond COVID, mental health, stress, suicide, or other kinds of diseases. So let me just remind folks that you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm almost out of time with ASHTON VERDERY-A. I get so interested in what you're talking about, I forget to remind people they're listening to COVID Calls. I wanted to ask you about activism, ASHTON. I mean, you did write this piece in the Washington Post, and it made some, a translation of data into a call for action in the political space, and you chose to publish that in the national platform. I don't know if you call yourself an activist, but I do wonder two levels. Yourself and your colleagues. When you think about actions you can take that go beyond peer-reviewed papers, what are those actions? And I think by extension, many of us listening will want to know what we can do to support. I think that the anti-vaxxers and the angry people and the truckers get a lot of news coverage, and I understand why they do, but there's an enormous reservoir of empathy and support out there too, and we all encounter it every day, and that needs to be supported. And so I'd like to hear from you how you think people can support those who are bereaved.
I think I've always struggled with the activism science divide, and I guess I've always found myself more inclined towards I would like to write the report and let other people make policies on the basis of it, because I don't have the training or the capacity to really do that. And I think COVID sort of has thrust me a little bit more onto the side of speaking about policies that I think would make sense than I historically had been comfortable with. And this is definitely, I guess maybe I wouldn't say I was dragged unwillingly, but I was certainly helped along the way by my fantastic co-authors, Rachel Kidman, Margolis, and Emily Smith Greenaway, in terms of kind of being able to say, no, the implications of this are clear. We should say that if we think it. But my own personal philosophy on it is I would always rather be trying to present the best possible information that I can and let people make the decisions on the basis of that. I believe in activism in my personal life, but like scientific life, I found it's a challenge for me to really strongly do that outside of some circumstances. But that said, I think this crisis, the implications were, so clear to us that we felt, that I felt, that it was worthwhile for us to pursue the path that my co-authors were interested in pursuing. In terms of how individuals around the country in this, to tap into this well of empathy, I think that coming up with policies that prevent these problems would be hugely beneficial. I think we need better preparedness for pandemic planning in the future. We need better disaster preparedness overall. I think that we also could recognize that some risk factors are mitigatable. And the loss of a parent one is relatively clear. The research is shockingly clear, in my opinion, that children who receive government benefits, Social Security from when their parents die and things like that, succeed at much higher rates than children who fail to receive those things in the similar circumstances, and that we're not reaching all of those kids. This is a policy that exists. Social Security gives children whose parents were eligible survivor benefits, but we're not reaching all of them. I mean, that seems like a gap we could very easily close, whether your whatever your policy opinions are. I think we could make an effort to close that gap. And so I think working with representatives to kind of close that would make sense. Continuing to expand some of these or maintain some of these expanded child tax credits and things like that, I think also would be beneficial, because the evidence is quite clear that the largest group in poverty in the U.S. In the last couple decades has been children, and that this the recent expansions of child tax credits have slashed that poverty rate enormously. And so I think continuing to concentrate efforts in those regards would be very beneficial as well.
Well, we're just out of time. I want to sneak one more question and get sort of thinking into the future. I'm always thinking about memorials and modes of social healing. Do you have an intuition that if we actually can get a proper memorialization process underway for COVID, that it will perhaps meet some of these bereavement effects, that it might lessen some of the bereavement effects for people over time? Like a COVID Memorial Day, for example, which Kristen Urquiza and the Marked by COVID group have been pushing for, something that does give people a way to grieve publicly and heal. Is something that you would look for as a way to blunt these impacts over time?
I think that this is me speaking without the benefit of evidence, but
I make you uncomfortable when I get you away from the data. I realize that. I'm sorry, but you're so knowledgeable on these issues. I really wanted to ask you.
I think it would be a good thing. I think it would be a moral and just thing to do. And I also think that it is a strategically a good idea, not just in terms of assuaging the grief of individuals who've experienced this, but also creating this milestone of why do we mark this? And I think we still mark Veterans Day and things like that, and it brings up recollections of long-term challenges that we've faced as a country, and stops us from forgetting. The United States, we don't want to forget 9/11. We want to remember the challenges that posed for the country. Pearl Harbor similarly. And I think marking the deaths from COVID-19 might have a similar impact. One of the big potential explanations for the failure of policy response to COVID-19 is that we largely forgot about the 1918 flu pandemic and even the 1950s flu pandemics as well. And I think that having a way to remember that that persists beyond the generation who experienced it would also be very beneficial. And the death is of a scale that I think it would make sense to do so.
I just want to remind folks you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can usually catch COVID Calls now live at 7 p.m. Eastern Time weekdays, and we'll have lots of days coming up with multiple COVID Calls as we move towards the 2-year mark on March 16th of this year. And so please do stay tuned for that. And I want to thank my return guest, ASHTON VERDERY, who's also been responsible for opportunities to interview your colleagues and the ripple effect. That's a positive research multiplier effect in this instance. You've opened my mind to a whole way of thinking about disasters that really I just was very murky to me before, Ashton. You're a great researcher and a good teacher, and I really appreciate you coming on, spending this time.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to get to talk to you. And I think the ability, sociologists and historians should chat more often, I would say. We can learn a lot from each other.
Well said. I'll leave it with that. ASHTON VERDERY, thanks again for your time on COVID Calls. Stay healthy, everybody. We'll see you next time.